Alright, hey guys. My name's Nisha, and for those of you who don't know me, I am a former computer science student. I transferred here from the University of California, Berkeley, which is in the United States, and I thought I would put together a little mini tutorial lecture about a few specific topics that I feel like we could all brush up on a bit. Let me type them up here. So, the scope of what I'm going to cover today is for loops, nested for loops, and then we're going to cover the map function, and then after that we're going to cover arrays. So I think these four topics are things that really help accelerate your code and the quality of it, but a lot of people are still struggling to understand some of the syntactical things and when to use them, when not to use them, which is totally understandable. They're kind of complicated things to understand at first. But once you understand them, it's super rewarding. So let's start with for loops. So what we're going to do right now, put this in a comment at the top so you guys can follow along in case you get lost. We are going to draw 10 circles with a for loop. So let's start. So the simplest thing to start doing is we're not even going to include a for loop right now. We're just going to do something really simple, which is drawing a circle. So for those of you who don't know this website, hopefully you're super familiar with it, but I use it all the time, even though I've been programming for like 10 or so years now. And it pretty much contains all the syntax you need for whatever functions you're looking for. So here you can see the circle function. This is the x-coordinate, the y-coordinate, and the diameter of the circle. So I'm just going to directly copy it in from the reference into our code right here. So the x-coordinate and the y-coordinate are where we're going to draw the circle on the screen. And I want to draw it on the center of the screen right over here. So we're going to take the middle of the canvas, which in this case is window width, but we're going to divide that by 2. So now we're drawing it horizontally in the center of the canvas. And I'm going to do the same thing for the y-coordinate. I'm going to take the window height, and I'm also going to divide that by 2. And maybe a safe diameter, I'm just going to guess maybe 50, just so that we can see it. And make sure whenever you use a function call like this is called a function call because the circle is a function. It's what you use to draw the circle. And you're calling it because you just use its name. And we're going to add a semicolon right here. Don't forget that. Alright, so let's make sure this works. We see nothing. Very cool. And one of the reasons for this might be that we have not specified a fill color. So what we're going to do is we're going to fill everything past this point with black. For those of you who don't know, 0 is the black fill color. So still not seeing anything. Wonder why? It's probably because we're drawing the background after we draw the circle. So what's happening right now, we did draw the circle when it's being drawn, but the problem is we drew the background on top of it. So let's move the background. I'm going to cut and paste it at the very top of our draw loop. And that should help fix things. Perfect, we see a circle being drawn. I'm going to make it a little bit bigger, maybe 200. And you can see it very well. So we have a circle, no for loop needed, but you know, this is one circle. We could draw, I'm gonna make this a little bit smaller. We could, if we want to draw more circles, just duplicate this function a bunch of times. You know, circle, 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 up until the fact that we get 10 circles. But the fact of the matter is, this code is super messy, and so what we want to do is we want to refactor or clean up this code so that way we incorporate a for loop so we don't have a bunch of duplicated lines. So we're going to introduce the for loop right now. Let's comment this out for 1 second. Don't delete it yet. So we're going to start the for loop declaration just by typing in for, the word. And the way it works is you start by defining a variable. It can be called anything. And we're going to define this variable with the let keyword. The let keyword is super important. I'm not going to get too much into what this means, but all it is that you're defining a variable. You're giving it a name and you're assigning it something. So in this case, I'm going to give our variable a descriptive name. So I'm going to call it num circles. Okay, so num circles, and I'm setting it equal to 0, because what a for loop is doing, in essence, is that everything in the body of the for loop, which is the stuff between these curly braces right here, is the stuff that's going to be repeated a certain amount of times. So you start the for loop, and this is the first time it's run, so there's no circles on the screen yet. And what we're going to do is we're going to say num circles is less than, see this variable up here that I've defined? Number of circles. So it's kind of intuitive. Number of circles is the total number of circles that we want to draw. And up here I said we want to draw 10 circles, so let's go ahead and set number of circles equal to 10. Alright, so now looking at this for loop, we're starting off by drawing 0 circles. And the second segment says we're going to stop drawing the circles when this condition is false. So num circles is less than number of circles. So just to clarify right now, num circles starts at 0, and it's going to run until num circles is greater than 10. So in total, the code in this for loop, it's going to run the body of this code, which is empty right now, 10 times, and then it's going to stop. And make sure, so there's going to be 3 segments total in this for loop. You want to make sure that each one ends with a semicolon. A lot of people add commas, which is syntactically incorrect, and your code isn't going to run. So make sure you add a semicolon. And we have 2 segments right now, and let's add the 3rd segment. So the first one, let me add some comments in case you guys want to take the code. So this one, define a variable at a number, then run the code until the variable reaches a certain number. Or I should say, then stop when the variable reaches a certain number. And so at this point right now, if we just ran this code, it wouldn't work because number of circles is always going to be equal to 0. It's never going to increment. So that last segment, the 3rd segment, is where we say num circles plus plus. And the plus plus means that we're adding 1 to it every time that we run the for loop. So just say we run this for loop once, goes down to the bottom, then we repeat the code. Then, since we added num circles plus plus, second time that we run the for loop, this is going to go from a 0 to a 1, and then from a 1 to a 2, and it's going to go up and up every single time it's ran. But once it reaches 10, we're going to check this condition. Is 10 less than 10? No, 10 is equal to 10. So then the for loop would stop running, and we'd move past it to the next line. So now we have this beautiful code. Let me add the final thing, which is increment variable by 1 every time for loop is run. Cool, so we have a for loop, but it is empty right now. And you can tell that it's empty again because the body of the for loop, the code that's going to be run 10 times, is the stuff in between these 2 braces. So there's nothing in these braces. So why don't we just go ahead and move circle inside the for loop. So I'm going to cut and paste it. So cool, that should work. Now let's run it. Alright, so as you can tell, nothing has changed, and the reason for that is because it's drawing the circle 10 times, but the circle is being drawn in the same spot. So if you check right here, you can kind of tell on the edges it's kind of noisier, and the reason for that is there are 10 circles here, but they're all flattened on top of each other. So what we need to do is we need to change the position of the for loop. And let me make this a little bit more clear. So let's say I'm going to take this fill value, put it here, and let's change the color of the circle to a random value every time. So random 255, random 255, random 255. Cool. So this code right here, it's going to fill each circle with a random value. So you can see that they're layering all of the circles on top of each other right now. So all the circles are changing colors, but they're all in the same place right now. So, alright, let's stop that. Let's make it so that it doesn't loop. So now if we run it, it's still being drawn on top of each other, all the circles are done, so let's space the circles out now. So let's see. We filled each circle with a random value, and each circle was in the same spot. So how do we space the circles out so they start on the left-hand side of the screen and end on the right-hand side of the screen? And that's where the beautiful map function comes in. So let's go check out the reference. So the description is that the map function remaps a number from one range to another. So a whole lot of information. I'm going to copy this. I'm going to put it right here. And for our case, we don't need within bounds. So the map still has 5 variables. And I totally get how intimidating it sounds at first, but hopefully it becomes easier to understand after this. So the important part about map is that it needs to be stored as a variable. So let's define a variable called xmap. And we're going to set xmap equal to this map function. And the reason why I'm calling it xmap is because if this map function works correctly, it's going to spread out circles from the left-hand side of the screen to the right-hand side of the screen. So let's first check out this value. So what exactly do we want to change? Because we want to take a value and we want to give it its initial range. So we say at first you started at 0 and you stop somewhere. But instead, I want to spread out this range so you start and stop at different values. So imagine like you have a piece of Play-Doh, and initially the Play-Doh is a certain amount wide, but once you stretch it out to its new width, it becomes start to stop to width that much bigger. So let me just clarify this a little bit. In our case, here's a simple trick of a little trick that I always use, is that when you use a map function inside a for loop, you automatically always fill the map value with the value from the for loop. So in this case, the value that we want to change is num circles, because we want to change the position of all 10 of these circles that are being drawn right here. Every circle has to be spaced out a little bit from its neighbor. And what is the initial size of num circles? So we know that num circles starts at 0, right? So it's going to start at 0. And where does it stop? Well, it only stops once it gets bigger than 10. Or in this case, it's equal to 10. It'll actually start at 0 and it'll stop at 9, because once 10 is equal to 10, this condition is false and so it stops running. So the stop value should actually be 9, not 10, because 0 to 9 is the exact same number as 1 to 10. So let me type it out. 1 to 10 is almost the same as 0 to 9. 1 to 10 is the same thing as 0 to 9, except it's moved over by 1. So we start at 0 and we end at 9. Now, where do we want to start drawing these circles on the screen? So I want to start drawing them at the very, very edge of the screen. So what x value is the very left of the screen? It would be 0. So it actually starts at the same location as it was initialized at. But the important part is that the stop value right here needs to be on the very right-hand side of the screen, which in this case is window width, right here. Bam. Oops. And let's run it. So it's still nothing right now, because we haven't used the xmap variable right now. We need to tell in our code somewhere to draw at this new position. So what we did right now, what xmap is returning is a position for every one of these circles on the screen. So for each circle, it has a new position. Whereas before it was drawn in the same position, xmap is like, hey, I have a new position for you, so go here. So that's why we use xmap in our circle function. And let's see, where should we use it? We can either use it to specify the new x position, the new y position, or the radius. And we know for a fact we want all of these circles to be the same size, so we're not going to put it in the radius. And in this case, we're drawing from 0 to window width, so we shouldn't be using the y position, but we should be changing this for the x position instead. So instead of window width over 2, we want them all to draw at the same height, but we don't want them all to draw at the same width. So what this map function is doing is spread the 10 circles out on the screen so they fill the entire canvas. And parentheses width-wise. You'll see what I mean in a second. So let's run it. Oh, look at that, beautiful. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 circles, and they're all being drawn at new x positions across the screen. And this was made possible thanks to the xmap function. So without the xmap function, they would all be drawn on top of each other. So notice I didn't change the window height to xmap because we want them all to draw at the same height, for right now at least. It is a little bit weird though because these are getting clipped off the screen. So the way we can fix this is 0 and window width are the positions that we're starting and ending at. So this circle is being drawn exactly at 0, and this one's being drawn exactly at window width. So why don't we add a bit of a margin? Let's create a margin up here, and maybe we can make the margin, I don't know, 100. So it'll have a margin of 100 pixels before it reaches the end of the screen. So instead of drawing them at 0, let's start drawing them at margin. So it's going to start drawing at 100 pixels. And then, instead of drawing exactly to window width, let's draw to window width minus margin. So it doesn't draw exactly to the end of the screen. It'll draw almost to the end of the screen. So let's run it. Boom, now they're all on the screen. Maybe what we can do now, let's make a variable for circle size. Make it, what do you think, like 70? And then wherever we reference the circle size, which should only be right here, let's just make this a variable. Rule of thumb, use variables whenever you can, because chances are you're going to need those variables more than once. It'll save you a lot of time if you have a lot of lines of code. You don't have to go through each individual line and change it. You can just change it once up here and it updates everywhere. So run it again. Alright, cool. So we have the circles lined up just like we want. So number 1 accomplished. But what about drawing these in a 10 by 10 grid? What if we wanted to have them all have different y variables? So for example, drawing 100 total circles in the form of a square, where this is 1 row out of 10 rows. How would we do that? So that's where number 2 comes in, where you're going to draw a grid of 10 by 10 circles with a nested for loop. Cool. So how will we go about doing that? So we've clarified that the for loop runs everything inside of its body, which in this case is this code. It's going to run all of this code 10 times. But what we want it to do now, we want it to do this code 10 times, and then we want to move the rows so that we draw 10 more rows. So we want this thing to be duplicated. So that's when we would use a nested for loop. So we would add another for loop up here. And let's initialize. I would say it's not good practice to use the same variable for 2 separate for loops, especially if they're nested for loops, because if I make this num circles equals 0, and it also sees this variable as num circles, it might override the variable, so we might get weird, wonky results. So what we want this for loop to do, we want it to duplicate this row being drawn. So we want it to draw new rows. So let's call this num rows. And again, we start with 0 rows, and we're going to stop drawing when the number of rows hits 10. In this case, the number of circles is also 10 because it's a square, so I'm going to use the same value. We're going to stop drawing rows once we hit 10 rows. And then, every time we run the for loop, we're going to increment it. So bam. There we go. And then, remember that the for loop only runs the code that's inside of it. So we actually want it to run this for loop 10 times. So let's close our braces right here. So what is it doing right now? Let's take a look. So this for loop is run 10 times. But this is where your brain might hurt a little bit. This for loop also runs 10 times. So what does that mean? This for loop will run this code 10 times on top of running itself 10 times. So we don't actually run this for loop 20 times. We run all of this code in both of the for loops 100 times. So nested for loops run code x squared times. 2 for loops, in this case, draw 100 circles. So I would say spend some time with these 2 for loops and get to understand them a little better, but the main takeaway is that the code in this for loop is being run 10 times, but this for loop runs the for loops 10 additional times, so in total it's running it 100 times. So that's how we get 100 circles on the screen, or 10 rows, 10 columns. So the question is now, how do we change the y position of each circle? And the answer is honestly pretty easy, so we're going to use exactly the same syntax as we do for the x map right here. And what we want to do, we're going to copy and paste this code, and we're going to change it to y map. So this is going to change the y position of each circle. So what do we want to map in this case? We want to change the y position somehow, but how would we do that? Because number of circles, that value is not going to change the y position. What is going to change the y position is number of rows though. So why don't we change this to num rows? And let's see, where does it start and where does it end? It's initialized at 0, so the start 1 value is going to be 0. And we're going to stop when the number of rows is equal to the number of circles, which would be when number of rows equals 10. So it's actually still going to be 0 and 9 because we're going to run this code 10 times. And where do we want it to start on the screen in the y position? So we want it to start up here, around 100. So margin's still fine. And the only other thing we have to change now is this one, because we don't want it to draw to the window width, because window width is way over here and it might be longer than window height. We want to change it to window height. That way, it'll start at the top, and it'll draw all the way down until it almost reaches the bottom of the screen here. So let's add a comment. Spread each row of 10 circles on the screen so they fill the canvas height-wise. So cool, just exactly like we did with X map, we're going to take Y map and put it as the Y position for the circle, because Y map gives each circle a new position. Let me add that as a comment too. X map and Y map give each circle new X and Y position. It remaps the circle position. Cool, so let's run this and see what happens. Oh, beautiful. So now we have a grid of 10 by 10 circles with a nested for loop. And we've done that pretty well, very beautifully here. And the last step is the arrays. So let's say I don't want to use a random color for each circle. Let's just say I want to use, how about 4 colors? I want to either draw a circle that's blue, green, yellow, or red, and I don't want anything else. How would I do this? And the simplest answer that I can think of is using an array. And what an array is, think of it like a bookshelf. This is an empty bookshelf because this is how you define an array. You define an array exactly the same way you define any variable. The only difference is that it can hold multiple things. Think of it like a bookshelf or like a shopping cart. You can put stuff in the shopping cart, you can take stuff out of the shopping cart. Order doesn't necessarily matter as much in most cases. For now at least, we're going to use this color array shopping cart call it to hold a shopping cart filled with 4 colors. And for those of you who aren't familiar with hex colors, nothing super important here, but each color on the color spectrum, at least in a design sense, corresponds to a hex color. So it's very, very rare, if not impossible, to find two different colors with the same hex color. So think of the hex color as like a name for each color. Even if you just change the colors slightly, you can see those hex values changing. And they mean something complicated in the RGB world, but that's kind of out of scope for right now. So let's use a hex color for blue. Let's choose this beautiful color blue. And it has this corresponding hex value. Let's go ahead and copy it, and let's paste it in here as a string. This part is important. So right now, the color array, it has one element in it. So the color array is a shopping cart filled with colors. Let's just go ahead and populate it right now. I'll explain exactly how it works in a minute, but the important thing to know is that this array has one element right now, but it can hold up to close to an infinite amount of colors or strings or variables or integers. It can hold whatever you want it to. It doesn't really matter. And the way you separate it, each element, is you add a comma. So let's pick a green color right now. This one's fine. Maybe a little bit darker. Let's copy the hex color for it. And let's paste it in as a string. So now we have 2 elements. Let's get a yellow color. Let's paste that in. And let's grab a red color. Cool. So now our array has 4 elements. And there's an important thing to note with the color array, or any array for that matter, is that each element in the array corresponds to an index number. And it's simple. First element is the number 1, second element is number 2, third element is number 3. So it's like, depending on the position in the array, it has a different index number. But the way indexes work with arrays is the index of the first element is actually 0. So in programmer language, we talk in terms of starting at 0. They always teach you in grade school to start at 1 and count up. 1, 2, 3, 4. You don't start at 0 and count up. But in the programming world, it's pretty much always necessary that you start counting at 0. This goes for a lot more complicated concepts as well, but that's why the index for the second element is 1, index for the third element is 2, index for the fourth element is 3. So it's a little weird at first, makes things a little bit more difficult to understand, but the important thing to know is that each index corresponds to an element in the array. So, beautiful. Alright, so now we have an array with 4 elements, but what do we do with it exactly? Well, first, let's understand how to access each element in the array based on its index. So, let me just add a little tag so you guys remember what colors correspond to what index. So this one corresponds to blue, this one corresponds to green, this one corresponds to yellow, and this one corresponds to red. Cool. Awesome. So let's start off with a simple example. How do we just access the color blue? Just say we want all of our circles to be blue. How would we go about doing that? And the best part about arrays is that you can access any element that you want based on the index. So we know that the index number for the color blue is 0. So let's go down, see where we fill each circle with a random color. Instead of using a random value, let's fill each circle with blue. And how do we do that? So we know that the array holding the blue color is called color array. So that's the important part, is you need to specify which array you're taking the color from. So it's called color array. And this is the simplest part. Just check out which index number you need and just use that. So index is 0, that corresponds to blue. So I'm going to use a square bracket and type the value 0. And this is going to fill each circle with the 0th index in the color array. So index 0 is blue. So if I run this, it should fill every circle with blue. Perfect, and it's the exact shade of blue that we picked earlier. So what if we want to fill each circle with, say, yellow? Check out what the index is. This index is 2. So change the array to 2 instead of 0. This is going to fill each circle with yellow. Bam, beautiful. Now, what if we want to fill each circle with a random value, but each random value has to be one of these colors? So you can either fill each circle with blue, green, yellow, or red. How would we do that? Well, the best part is that each element now corresponds to an index number. And the index number is either 0, 1, 2, or 3. So let's just take a random value between 0 and 3, or in this case 0 and 4, because random 0 through 4 doesn't include 4. It includes 0, 1, 2, and 3. So if we just pick a random index and then pop it in right here, that'll give us a random value that's in the array. So let's fill each circle with a random color in color array. And the way we're going to do this, just to make it a little bit more separated, is we're going to create a new variable called random color. And we're going to set it equal to a random value between 0 and 4. And this will give us a random number that's either 0, 1, 2, or 3. Doesn't include 4. Just remember that for future reference, if you type 0, 4, it's either going to give you a number that's between 0 and 4 isn't inclusive. So, not inclusive. But it will include 0, so it's kind of a little bit confusing. And the shorthand notation for this, random automatically defaults to 0 if you don't include the first parameter. So I can just choose random 4. That'll give us a random value between 0 and 4. Let's use this random color. Instead of typing 2, let's put random color in the color array. So we get that random color, and we're going to use it to generate a random index from the color array. So if we run this code right now, we should have exactly what we want. Each circle becomes one color that's either blue, green, yellow, or red, but it has to be in the color array. So let's run it. So the reason why this doesn't work, forgot to mention, random 4 gives you a number that is between 0 and 3, but it could be a decimal. And so that's why we have an error, is that random 4 could give us a number that's like 3.2, whatever. It could give us some infinitely long decimal. So what we want to do, we want to round this random value, which could be a decimal, to an integer. So that's what floor does. Floor rounds random to an integer. So just to clarify, floor rounds the decimal to the nearest integer. And if we run it now, awesome. So hopefully that was a helpful tutorial. Just to clarify what we did, we drew 10 circles with a for loop. We drew a grid of 10 by 10 circles with a nested for loop. And then we used an array to specify a list of random colors for each circle. Yeah, so thanks so much for watching, guys, and I will save a copy of my code so that way hopefully you guys can play around with what I did. But yeah, have a good one, guys.